seconds for it to, you know, do its thing. Right, let me move that out of the way. And then we can get ready. Normally at this point, I'm like putting on lip gloss. I might just do a little quick look. I'm known for this, isn't it?
I always am.
No, I always do this. I always wait till like the minute when we're doing it, when I'm not. Oh, I should really be more organised beforehand, but I'm amongst friends, so I can do that.
Ah, the glasses.
Yeah.
I love them.
Thank you so much. Can't see a thing, but you know. Somebody said they're really not prescription. I was like, no. And they said, you want to, like, you can get them, take them to the shop. And I said, I think they're so cheap. The second anyone tried to take out the lens, I think the whole thing was
They look good, so that's okay.
That's all I need, Michelle. It's all I need. Right, so here we go. Let me go and put on my little banner so at least people they know to say hello. It's funny that some people feel like they need permission to say hello and they don't. So I'm just going to grant them. Yay, hey, hello. Right, so hopefully they'll see us, right? Well, we're recording, so we can get started talking, and then hopefully some people can join when they have the time. So, right, I don't even know where to start because, you know, like I don't rehearse this clearly because I'm just like in the moment. But I thought, Claudia, we would start, I guess, where we connected based on a friend we have in common sent me a link to an article that you wrote. I think it was like the beginning of June. Was it the beginning of June? It feels like ages ago. Was it?
Yeah, I think so. I've lost all concept of time, but I think it was around the beginning of June.
Yeah.
Could have been March, could have been last week. I'm not sure.
I was trying to remember. I was like, what? I think it was June. So I'm going to say June tentatively, and then you can like correct me. But I think it was like maybe beginning of June. So, I guess, should we start there? Do you want to, for anybody who hasn't seen it, and you just talk us through the article, and then we can just like get into it? Because I've got so much to say. I've got stuff to talk to you about the messages I've been getting over the weekend when people found out I was talking to you both. So we can like we're going to get in.
Yeah. So I suppose just as a bit of background, we at the JLC over the last 3 years have been having a very public campaign against anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has always been in society, but the last 3 years it has felt really prominent. It's felt like it's been on the front line of politics. And as a community, as an organization, we were fighting it really frontline and center. And I suppose when all the protests after the George Floyd killing took place, it just brought home how, you know, there's racism everywhere, there's racism in different communities, but it very much looks different depending on which community is being affected. And we felt, well, I felt certainly that, you know, I wanted to talk about other kinds of racism, but I felt very nervous because I was very aware of the fact that when it comes to anti-Semitism, I understand the issues, I understand the nuances, I live and breathe it as a Jewish person, but also as someone who works in this field professionally. But that when it came to racism against Black people, I understood that, of course, it's always been an issue, it's always been there, it's never gone away. But it felt like there was a moment, and that moment needed to be seized upon. But I wasn't quite sure how to do it sensitively, if my voice was wanted, if it was needed. But what I was sure of is that when we were fighting this issue in the Jewish community, I was really grateful when people outside the community lent their voices to us. And so I just thought, is now the time, is our voice wanted, is it needed? But I had a lot of kind of anxiety about it, as in I wanted to lend my voice, but I wasn't sure exactly how to. And I suppose since then, just been having lots of conversations, educating myself. It's been great following some of your videos because I think you just speak very emotively, very much from the heart, and listening to the things that you have said has been really, really educational, particularly for me. And I think others who I've shared your material with.
Yeah, and I think, you know, one of the, well, gosh, there's so much things I want to talk about. And actually, I just want to take a step back and talk a little bit about anti-Semitism. And the reason why I want to start off with that before we get, you know, into this is that, so I posted, I think, like, I don't know when exactly, because a bit like we said at the beginning, I lose concept of all time. Like, I don't know when I posted what, because there's so much stuff, right? So anyway, I did this post and I was like, right, I'm talking to the Jewish Leadership Council, and I'm like thinking this is like the best thing since sliced bread. I'm like, yes, this is perfect, because exactly to your point, it's this whole, I am very unapologetic in the fact that I do come at everything from about improving the experiences for Black people, particularly in the workplace. So I make no apologies for that. But I also am as vocal about saying that it's going to take so many of us to keep pushing and speaking up and being vocal and amplifying the voices of Black people. And, all of those things are so important. So clearly, like, I'm wanting to talk to as many people as possible. I'll be like knocking on people's door going, hello, so can we talk? Because when people see this sort of conversation, I want it to be those conversations that are replicated in homes, in organizations, in community. That's my rationale, I guess. Like I don't have a plan, but you know what I mean? That's the thing. But when I posted that post, and I did have some messages over the weekend, they're a bit like, why are you talking to the Jewish Leadership Council? And it's different people, because I know, Claudia, you saw this, but Michelle, I don't know if you saw that I can't even remember when, but I did this video about anti-Semitism and Wiley. And let me tell you, do you know how many people came for me and was just like, why are you talking about it? Do you not know? What was somebody telling me? Like, do you not know the history of Zionism and this and that? And if you as a Black person are talking about it, like, I was a bit like, oh my goodness, are you actually saying to me? And then some other people were saying, like, the racism that Jewish people experience, or the hate that Jews experience, is different from Black people. So again, why are you talking to Jewish people? And I was a bit like, excuse me, because I swear a lot. I was like, what the fuck? I was like, what the hell is this? So I guess, before we even get into this, like, is that something that you recognize in terms of this? It's strange for me, because I'm a bit like, somebody said something that's ridiculous, so I'm going to speak out about it, and then looking around and it's like crickets, because ain't nobody else saying anything. Do you know what I mean? That we've got something to say about everything else, but nothing to say about that. And then when I'm starting to get this whole confusion about why, as a Black woman, I am talking to the Jewish community, and I'm a bit like, do you not realize that there are Black Jewish people as well? Hello, right? So help me understand, Claudia and Michelle, because I can't. Do you know what I mean? I'll be like swearing forever at this rate, but I'm just like, help me understand it.
I mean, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the fact that there are Black Jewish people as well. And so for them, they'll face two types of racism. I mean, there are obviously always discussions about the hierarchies of racism and how different.
I call it oppression Olympics.
Yeah, it's a complete bugbear of mine. I think it's fine to say that Black people and Jewish people experience racism in very different ways. But that doesn't mean that one is worse than the other. It means that they're both have their own nuances. And so, and that's going back to what I said earlier, is that I can't know what it feels like to be treated badly as a Black person, because I'm not a Black person. I know what it feels like to be on the receiving end of anti-Semitism because I'm Jewish. And so your experiences and our experiences will differ. But I think the fight is the same. The fight is against racism. Racism is a completely unexplained prejudice against people just because of things that are beyond their control: your skin color, your religion, your race. And so I think it's important that we think, how do we solve this issue? I'm not confident that racism will ever go away, but I think even though it looks different for different communities, the fight against prejudice is the same. And so this doesn't have to be about racism. This can be about lots of different issues. So I understand why people have said that, and I think the distressing thing is that we have seen anti-Semitism from the Black community. We've seen racism against Black people from the Jewish community. And I think the reason this distresses me the most is because we are both from communities where we understand what it's like to be victims of prejudice. So why are we not working together more closely, as we're attempting to do now, to try and say racism is racism, regardless of where it's targeted? And there are things that we can learn from each other. There are ways that we can be allies to one another, and we should definitely attempt to do that.
Michelle, what's your view?
I mean, I suppose it's there's so many different complicated facets to things, and I think that, as Claudia's tried to say, I've been thinking a lot about the difference between empathy and understanding recently, and from our conversation the other day. And I will never know what it's like to be a Black person because I'm not Black. You may never know, unless you convert to Judaism, what it's like to be a Jewish person. And I think the empathy can be a bit empty sometimes because we like to think that we understand. Just because we may have experienced something under one guise doesn't mean that we've experienced it in the same way that as another person. And I think that's our responsibility as well. And if we reflect back on what Claudia was talking about in her writing, actually we have a responsibility to understand, to ask, and not to be afraid to ask.
Yeah.
So I suppose if we can be an example of being brave and asking, or explaining, I understand what it feels like from my position. I am a Jew. I've experienced anti-Semitism. I'm not saying it's the same, but I appreciate that you are experiencing a type of oppression or a type of racism. What does that feel like for you? And how do we understand how to work together to combat that? And I think, as you said, Claudia, I'm under no illusions that I often say in my work, I work with leadership and organizational development. I wish I had a magic wand. And what would you do if you had a magic wand? Like that, there's no magic wand for this at the moment. Actually, we can, by understanding, not just empathizing, not just feeling sorry and I'm sorry you've had it, but really genuinely appreciating and talking like this, what's our experience, understanding to a deeper level that's not just, the lip service and the virtue signaling.
Yeah, and I think, even for me, and I was a bit like, oh, right, I'm talking to Claudia and Michelle, and I was like, shit, like, what do I know about, do you know what I mean? Do you know when you get that moment? I was like, what do I know about the Jewish religion? Do you know what I mean? You start to question yourself. I was like raised Catholic. I'm not practicing Catholic. I like to say I'm like a learning Buddhist. Do you know what I mean? So that's the philosophy that I buy into. So I'm spiritual, but probably not religious, right? So I was very conscious that even the way that I would approach just learning about other religions full stop is from a place of almost like somebody who has distanced themselves from religion. Does that make sense? So, like I'm not expecting you to tell me anything to make me understand. I'm just curious, right? And so, and that's fine. But I was curious and I guess perplexed by the strength of feeling that, some Black people that I know had about me even engaging in this conversation and asking questions. And I'm talking about some of the books that I'm reading, etc. And this is not a comparison. I'm just being honest and, letting everybody know, as I am always honest. And I'm thinking, well, I've got the Quran in my house, right? So I can tell you about some of the things that I've looked into about, being a Muslim and all the rest of it. And so why are you not coming so hard for me about that? But you want to come, and that's when you kind of get into, and I guess whether people want to get caught up in the semantics, like you said, about what's different between, anti-Semitism versus anti-Black racism. For me, to your point, it's not about the difference, but I'm just thinking, like, if we talk about hate, and even when we talk about anti-hate, we focus on the behavior and the words, don't we? So it's like, when people call the names. And I'm still going, but we still have to talk about the system of oppression. We still have to talk about, how is it that if we hold tight to our ignorance and not understanding, to your point, Michelle, about the experiences of other people, then we are walking through life not questioning some of the very systems that are right underneath our eyes. But because we don't see that lived experience and understand or empathize, it's not about understanding and empathize with it, we don't challenge it where we could be in the prime position to challenge it. That's where I'm coming from when I talk about allies and getting people together. Do you know what I mean?
I think the key to what you've just said, Shireen, though, is you've articulated the fact that you didn't understand and therefore you ask questions. And I think a lot of the time that's our stopping point, that's our barrier. We don't understand, or we have an assumption and we're quite happy with that assumption and we carry on through our life with that. And that, the hate is bred by the ignorance, because we are quite content, and you see it generation upon generation, that you don't look up, you don't explore, and you don't ask questions. And your starting point has been, I don't know, therefore I will ask questions, rather than I don't know, so I'll just go along with what I think I know or what I don't know, and I'll be happy with it. So actually, if we continue to ask questions, just as we would want people to ask questions of us, you would want to explore. You don't want people to make assumptions. There's all sorts of research done about the preconceived ideas about when you walk into a room or what people look like, and there's a lot of training now around bias and implicit and unconscious bias. So actually, let our starting point be about asking, just as when we've had through this crisis, the questions that we ask are, how are you? And then we ask again, how are you really? Because the first answer often hasn't got the depth to it. So for me, it's often about the questions.
I think there's also a reticence for people to ask questions because it's such an emotive subject that deeply affects people, and they're scared to ask the wrong thing in case they get the wrong terminology or they're seen to be on the wrong side. They ask something out of ignorance. And there's this kind of assumption that if you say the wrong thing, even if the intent isn't bad, that you're suddenly on the wrong side. And I do think that people feel very, very anxious to ask questions. And I think, Shireen, some of the stuff that I've seen you talk about before is that you almost instinctively know if someone's coming at something from a good place. And I think that takes a while to understand. Not everyone has got great judgment or is able to judge people on their intentions. And I think that does come with experience. You can tell from the way people ask something, whether it's a genuine question that where they want to learn, they want to educate themselves, or if they're asking questions just to kind of aggravate the situation and show, that they don't mean to ask something bad, but what their real intent is. And so I think, sometimes we do have to separate intent from the way people really are. And so I encourage people to ask questions, and if they say something or they think something which isn't right, to explain to them why, I know why you might believe that. That might be something that you learned when you were younger or you picked up on, social media, but actually the reason that that's hurtful to the community is because of this and this and this. Like, give people that opportunity to learn and grow and understand. And I think that's where we're coming from when we're speaking to other communities about the racism that they experience. What does it look like for you? What are the things that are hurtful to you? What's the history? How can we help? How can we speak out more? What things shouldn't we be saying?
And I think, the thing for me, and I was saying to you before, like, I didn't know who was going to tune in. It might be like, your family, Michelle's family, my family, and that's probably about it. So we're all just talking amongst ourselves, right? But one of the things that I, thinking about my experience, everyone's seen my up and downs, like, I'm annoyed, I'm more, I'm more patient, and, but I think the hardest thing for me in all of this, when we talk about allyship, right, and what people can support, I think the hardest thing for me is when I have to explain to people that the interactions that I have, they are not always with people who have got the memo. Do you know what I mean? They are not, like, I would love to tell you that I spend most of my time talking to people who already, and when I say understand, it's not about understanding my lived experience. They already recognize that we are living in a world that isn't as they thought it was, in the same way that I'm looking at things through a different way. So a lot of the time people are still coming with this whole, but you have to prove to me, Shireen, that racism is a thing. Like, you have to prove to me that systemic racism is a thing, because I think it's about the fact that people aren't educated enough. So if they were educated, they wouldn't be treated badly. Or I think it's about the culture, and they're rattling off all of this stuff. So going back to your point, Claudia, about trying to like sift through that, and I'm not only am I sifting through this information, and I get, and when I have these conversations, these are not random people off the street. These are people who work in very well-known organizations, who have leadership roles, and like, it's almost like I have to try and separate myself from myself, because otherwise you get sucked in the emotion. And I go back to being upset and frustrated and hurt, that I'm just thinking, why is it when we have all of this history about, you know, how we're treated as Black people and oppression, and also, if you want to take a step out, how history has shown how we've treated other groups. Do you know what I mean? And you know, not to your point, not about the same level, but yet how are we in 2020 where we're still spending a lot of our time trying to justify the fact that we're even having this conversation to try and improve things that should have been improved decades, if not generations ago? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. It sometimes feels like you're fighting an uphill battle, and you make some progress, and then you see some of the vitriol that come, you know, the things that you're saying about the fact that these are comments from people with LinkedIn accounts, people in professional, you know, professional industries who you expect to know better. And I do think that sometimes when people feel things so personally, they do lose all rhyme and reason. And it sometimes you've got to step back and take yourself out of it, because I also think, and this is what I personally experienced, you know, when we were working so hard on this issue of anti-Semitism in politics over the last few years, that sometimes I felt I couldn't see the wood for the trees. Like I didn't know what was real anymore. And I felt I was fatigued myself. I thought, is the general public fatigued from hearing about this? But I think we were determined that the issue was so big and that the community felt so affected that, sure, some people might feel fatigued, but that's just tough luck. It doesn't mean that you stop talking about it. But there may be smarter ways of talking about it. What language do you use to make sure people understand what it is you're talking about, and that it doesn't just look like me, 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 me? Because sometimes it can look like you're being really self-indulgent. And the point that we've always made is, this isn't about self-indulgence. This is about, you know, oppression of a community, or, you know, prejudice against the community. But it isn't just the Jewish community. This impacts, you know, prejudice impacts people beyond the Jewish community. Prejudice against Black people impacts more than just Black people. It's bad for Black people, but it is bad for society. It is bad for us as a whole community. So yes, it might sound self-indulgent, but it's not just the issue facing us. It's the issue of facing the world, and we need to work together. So I do definitely agree with what you're saying.
I think it's really difficult as well, that it can feel like we might feel a bit miserable and depressed, and I can see some of the comments are like, you know, I can't believe we're still doing this. And actually part of the work that I do is around cultural change and organizations and culture, and it takes a very, very long time to change culture. And I think we have to remind ourselves every so often just to look back a bit and to be encouraged about the journey forward. And yes, there is a big journey forward, but in the same way that we've seen leaps and bounds in other areas of prejudice, whether it's around gender or LGBTQ rights, and I'm not saying that any of these are where I would like them to be, but I think that point as well for me is the word perspective keeps coming up in my head. Is, you know, what I feel the world, what the world looks like to me is very different from you, Shireen, is very different from you, Claudia. And every time we interact with somebody else who isn't standing in our position, we have to try to place ourselves in their position, and we don't do enough of that. That's the inquiry as well. So when we come up against somebody who doesn't see the same, I'm quite short. There are lots of people who see the world differently from me. My children,
Michelle, so I'll be looking right over your head.
So you're the person who reaches the top shelf in the supermarket, which my children like to laugh at, by the way, because I can't reach things. But the world looks very different at my height than it does at your height, and we have to remind ourselves that where I've grown up, and the community I've grown up in, and the people I see, and the schools I go to, gives me a perspective that's totally different, even from the person who lives down the road to me. And it's again the questions, and it's again the understanding of how we place ourselves in relation to others. And I think we've got to think about that, and we've got to understand that, and move ourselves, walk, take a walk, look. There's so many phrases that you might use, walking in other shoes, and won't get with the cheesiness, but it's about perspective and plotting where you are and where do you want to move, and how do you help others to see? How do you buy glasses, Shireen, that help others to see through your lenses?
TK Maxx, everybody.
She went for the cheese. She went for the cheese.
I did. And I bought right into that, Michelle. Bought right into that.
Good.
But I'm going to just show this question from James. Everyone knows I'm really bad with the comments. I'm going to try and do my best. But this is, how do you break through the denial within the workplace? So if you think about from the, because one of the things that I was so looking forward to this, because also this is an opportunity for me to learn as well, because this is all a learning experience for me. But how did you, when you're trying to talk to organizations about anti-Semitism and how the Jewish community are feeling and how affected by it, and I want to particularly think about when Labour did not do what they should have done and showed moral courage and leadership and just deal with that properly in the way it should. How did you break that barrier? Because there are some people who let's put anti-black racism to the side, but don't want to even engage in the conversation about anti-Semitism. They don't want to touch it.
I mean, I think his question is about the workplace, which for us is slightly unusual because we're obviously working in a Jewish community organization. So it's not quite the same as if we were working in, just an organization that wasn't representing the Jewish community. And I think when we first spoke, we spoke about, I think you mentioned the phrase, bringing your whole self to work. And I was able to say to you, actually, like Michelle and I are able to bring our full selves to work because we work for Jewish communal organizations. But I have worked for other organizations that haven't been Jewish community organizations. And there have been parts of my identity that I felt like, oh, maybe it's, maybe I won't talk about that here. Maybe I won't explain that, I've got another festival that I'm leaving early for today, what have you. But I think, we have had to have these conversations outside of our organization, of course. And I think the experience of that has been that we felt there was an onus on us to educate not just kind of the political circles, but the wider public. And I won't lie, it's not easy, and the issue is still there. And sometimes we felt that perhaps the issue, by us talking about it, did become worse, because sometimes you put something on the agenda, and I think you probably would have experienced this with anti-black racism too. Suddenly everyone's talking about it.
Yeah. And also everyone talks to me about it who thinks that's the only thing I want to talk about. And I'm like, no, I want to talk about what's on Netflix last night. Yeah. So you see it everywhere. You see it. But
again, I sometimes think things need to get worse before they can get better, because people are kind of coming out of their shell, they're learning, they're asking questions, all the negativity around that does come out at the same time. But, that we have had to have very, very difficult conversations with, whether it's been the media or politicians and the general public, just to explain, this is anti-Semitism. This is what it looks like. You might not feel it, and we don't expect you to, but we're explaining to you the Jewish community feels hurt for all of these reasons. Yes, our history is unique, as every community's history is unique, and we're trying to explain why we feel the way that we do. And again, sometimes it does feel like you're just talking to yourself, but we have been heartened to hear how even people who were, on the front bench of the Labour Party did get it and do get it. So the work is not done, but it's definitely getting there.
Yeah, no, and I think, sorry, Michelle, you go. I know you wanted to say, no, you go.
No, I was going to say, I think you have to name something to change it as well. And I think, although Claudia and I are fortunate, we work in a Jewish organisation, so we can bring our whole selves in terms of our Judaism to work. But we also need to be mindful that there are many organisations within the Jewish community who work with non-Jews and who have significant numbers of staff who are non-Jewish and who are Black or of other ethnic minorities or other faith groups. And actually, that's important for us as a community to understand. How do we treat people who are non-Jewish in our organisations? The fact that we respect any holidays or religious days that they take. How do we make sure that just as we would want to be treated, or not experience anti-Jewish racism, that we don't have people who are racist towards people who are Black or any other any other minority. So I think it's really incumbent on us to understand that experience and talk about it. And I know that many organisations have really understood that more in the last few months. It's been really highlighted, and the experience, as Claudia said, the experience that we've had as a community and understanding how that feels for us. Again, it's the empathy, but also inquiry and understanding and asking, and really asking about experience and not making the assumption about what it means to be different within a place where there is a norm, which, by the way, I get frustrated by. Like, to be different, everybody is different in different ways, and the fact that we have norms or not norms is, that's a whole other kind of,
we can talk about that conversation. And I was going to say that this whole thing about recognizing individual experiences is also really, because I'm very conscious and very much aware that even though I'm like mouth almighty, do you know what I mean? Like, I don't shy away from many aspects of this conversation about racism, in a general sense. But what I always say to people is, just because you've heard like my experience and my views of the world, don't get it twisted. I am not talking on behalf of all Black people. I might tell you who has been whispering in my ear and tell me stuff, because I always talk about people whispering, because he tell me all sorts of things for the benefit of the greater good. So I'm always grateful. But I just talk about my experience, as a Black woman. I talk about the fact that I'm in, I've got a biracial daughter, I have a Black daughter, so I have all of that. My partner's from Estonia, so we've got all of that going on. And so my house is like just a mesh of cultures and languages and all sorts of stuff. So that's like my normal. But I think there's also this thing around, to your point about fatigue, Claudia, because I think there are some people that when they feel like they've heard all of this stuff, right, and it's like, to your point, it's been going on for ages, and it's a bit like, can't we change the channel? And as my friend on here, she commented on one of my posts, Aisha said, the thing is about this is that we don't get to take the jacket off. We can't take off the jacket of racism. We got to live with it every day. So we don't have the option of just like, I'm tired. Like, listen, we're tired too, right? You know what I mean? We're tired of being shot in the back 7 times. I can go there. But, and so when we see people dip in and out, or your point, Michelle, they stop at they have the conversation, they show empathy and they show listening. And then you start tipping into the feeling sorry, right? And it's like, oh, I'm really sorry that you've experienced this. I'm really sorry. And then that's it. And I'm a bit like, that's like a good start. That's what I say to people, that's the start. That is not the destination, my friends, because we got a system to dismantle. And your sympathy, I love it, not really, but you know what I mean? Like, I appreciate the fact that you're now recognizing, but that ain't going to help the system. And I think that's where, I always talk about active allyship, and I was like, forget the listening circles and reading the books and all the rest of it. Like, there's a time and a place for that. But back to your thing of what you wrote in your article, Claudia, it's about standing up and going, right, I'm going to do something, whatever that is. There's no magic something, silver bullet. One. Thank you. You said, I knew there's something. But, I want people to do something. And I guess I want people to not be so passive and just think, I'm all right, Jack, because it doesn't affect me, and I'm very empathetic and recognize that I too have been the one sat in my chair, also seeing other appalling things, behaviors, things that happen. And I too sat there and thought, oh, well, you know what, I'll just, so I always talk from a place of, I've been there, I've been that person doing it. But in this, we can't afford that because, people are tired. Well, let's give them a Red Bull. Do you know what I mean? Because we've got stuff to do, my friends.
Yeah, I feel really conflicted on this point because I think, like you said, there are so many issues that we can exercise about, whether it's racism or climate change or what have you. There are so many things that affect us every single day. And I don't think it's possible to expect that everyone is going to be an activist. I think we can expect that everyone is an ally or should be an ally. But I think it takes a type of person to be an activist. The thing that winds me up the most is what I see and I call it's not my term, but, political hobbyists, people who think, oh, look, this is a new trendy cause. let me put my hashtag on, and I wrote about this in the article, let me, share this picture, let this go viral, so that I can show I'm part of the cause. But what does that really mean? It shows that you're signaling to the world that you've adopted this cause. What have you done beyond that, other than to say you're part of a cause? You haven't done anything meaningful to change. Have you written a letter to your local MP? Have you joined a protest? Have you come up with things that you think would make a difference? Or are you just trying to be part of the new trend? And that's the thing that I always fear. And I think the reason I think it's particularly dangerous is because I think when you have kind of participated in that hashtag activism, you kind of feel you've done your bit. But actually, that's not enough for people who, as you say, are actually suffering discrimination day in and day out. As you said, you can't take off the jacket. So people might be bored by it, but they should just go and do something else. People who have to suffer this day in and day out can't just turn it on and off. They have to fight it until it's resolved.
I think I'm just thinking about James's question and how, how do we really break through in any environment? And I suppose there's the easy bit that Claudia's just spoken about, which is the hashtags and the signing this and doing that. And actually, you can't be fighting all the battles all the time.
That's true.
There's a point at which things become uncomfortable and awkward as well. And to move into the uncomfortable space is really difficult. And that's why we avoid it. Because actually standing next to somebody and saying, I see what's happening and I'm standing next to you and I will stand next to you all the way through you talking about it. And listening, because listening is hard when you feel uncomfortable. Because if you listen to somebody talking about an experience, even if it's not about you, if you're listening to a co-worker saying, actually, I felt really uncomfortable when you made that comment, and you're supporting them, you start to reflect on all the comments that you've made and all the things that you might have said, and then you start to feel awkward. And it goes back to what we were saying about not being afraid. Let's not be under any illusions. I will have made mistakes. I will have made people feel uncomfortable. I will have said the wrong things. I haven't got to this age without doing that. I hopefully have been told about it, have apologized appropriately, learnt from it, and won't make that mistake again. But unless we realize that we're going to fail, and unless we realize that it's going to be uncomfortable and we're going to feel awkward, we will never really be allies. We will never really listen to people, and we will never really understand. So let's be okay with being uncomfortable, because otherwise we'll never learn and things will never change.
Yeah. And I think the thing is, as well, as I didn't, and this is where I have to say to people, we've all got to practice what we preach. There's a difference between engaging in a conversation and asking questions versus expecting somebody to educate you in a whole 100, 200, 300 year history in 45 minutes. Do you know what I mean? Because there's some of that going on. People are a bit like, and I'm like, look, if you've done do the stuff out there so you can start your own journey, and then you can just engage in that conversation. And I think it does make it easier when you've at least attempted to do some work in this, because you're genuinely engaging this, and the conversation always goes a little bit like I didn't know this, I never saw something this way, I read this and I didn't and it's a very different vibe than when somebody's going, right, tell me, what is structural racism? Why do you think, and it's just a completely different, I don't know how to describe it, but it's just different when you know that somebody's coming from that place of they've done, I'm not expecting them to read the encyclopedia, but they've at least attempted to do something, and they're genuinely wanting to engage in a conversation rather than, get you to prove a point. Do you know what I mean?
Completely. I mean, you've taken the words out of our mouths, which is unusual for Michelle and I.
I was like, you two are not normally this quiet. It's I've just
it's just pensive now. You've given us a lot of food for thought.
Yeah, and I just think that's, because it is, it's tiring, isn't it? And it goes back to your point about the fact that when you're doing it and you're thinking to yourself, God, are people bored of this now? Are they, I think somebody put here, who was it? I just want to go back to this point. I don't know the context of this comment, quite judgmental, but I'm going to try and guess. How do you know what people have and haven't done? Correct me if I'm wrong, Claudia, but the point I think you were making is more about the performative business. That's really easy to see. That's
Yeah.
what you're talking, that's what I was talking about as well, actually.
Yeah,
I think that's what you meant, Alex, but you know, we're going to go with that. We'll go with that for now.
Yeah, I think that might have been in response to me saying that just seeing people kind of engaging in hashtag activism, and of course you don't really know what people are or not doing. That's, I'm talking about my experience and people that I know in my own networks. I've seen, oh well, that's great that you've posted your black square, but I know because I know you, and I really do know you've done nothing else. So well done.
When you ask them, and they're a bit like, yeah, I know it's terrible, and they can't move the conversation on from but it's terrible. So that's why I'm like, you know what, you're better off, my friend. Delete the hashtag, just like, because all that does is wind me up because I know you. So I'm talking about people that I know as well. Yeah,
exactly. But I actually think the reason I'm also conflicted with that is because I do think that noise, and this is what it is, it's a lot of the time it's noise rather than, active allyship. I can see some people are posting about. I do think that noise is important to kind of raise awareness, because sometimes you need that jolt, you need that mass of activity in order for people to stand up and pay attention. So I am conflicted in that this is helpful because it raises awareness, but it does also take away from people feeling that they have to do something more than just tweeting or sharing, a picture on Instagram. So I think it takes both. I think it takes people to make the noise and then the people to do the actual work.
Yeah, and I think you're right, because it can, when you hear and see so much stuff, you can be fooled into thinking that equals progress. I'm not saying that it doesn't, but the type of progress that I talk about is not, like, this is, we can talk like we've said, and you can have these whole engaging in these conversations, but until we're starting to address the fact that there are some inherent assumptions, and somebody asked what is structural racism, and I can just say in the nicest way possible, you can Google that, but from what I'm talking about is the fact that we have some practices that are clearly in place. When you see that Black people are not in certain spaces within society, we do not have the same access to opportunities, we do not get the same healthcare treatment, we are over-indexed in some areas and not in others. So when you look at that, the answer cannot boil down to individual people on their own. It's a bit like I remember talking to somebody still about having this meritocracy argument, and they were saying that in our business that we only hire the best person for the job. And I said that, well, for a start, that's categorically not true. It's you hire the best people that you have access to in the pool that you used, right? So that's a different thing. But what you have to be aware of, by you keep reinforcing that narrative, what you're actually saying is there are no talented Black people out there, because your argument is if they were good enough, they would be in my business. So when you play that back and they go, but that's not how I kind of meant it. And I was like, but that's what that means. So going back to the structural elements, the systemic elements. And it's like, those are the sorts of conversations that I say to people. If you do not have different people in your business, you've got to ask yourself why that is. And then whatever the answer is, you might be able to sleep with that answer. Okay, fine. But if you don't, then it takes you on a different path. But to not ask the question because you think it's just because Black people are not good enough is not good enough for me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think we need the shock sometimes. What Claudia said, we need to be reminded sometimes, because just as we may well have experienced this, either of you or others out there that are watching, you go into a new place of work and you walk in and you're like, oh, why does the fridge look like that? Or why is the photocopier there? Or why do you all go and do this? Because it's new, and you start to question things. And then after 6 months or a year, you are, that's what's done. And someone new comes in and they say, oh, why is the fridge always such a mess? Oh, that's just how it is here. Well, no, actually, the fridge could be cleaned, and you could, don't get me started on fridge.
I'm not going to say a word. I'm not going to say. I'll let you go. You carry on. Michelle.
That's actually, sometimes we need the mirror held up, and sometimes we need someone to remind us. And I know even recently someone has asked me, well, have you really experienced anti-Semitism? And I say, yes, I have. And I can give you examples. And I can give you examples that I didn't even know they were anti-Semitism, because I was a child. And only now do I understand that. And only now, as an adult woman, do I understand inappropriate things that happen. When you were going out in the 90s and you went to a club and that was just what happened. And now you think, well, that's not appropriate, because we wouldn't expect behave that way because we've changed our culture in some ways. So how do we understand that we can look back and understand that actually that was that experience, that we need to be shocked, we need to be reminded of what's appropriate for people to say to you or do to you or behave to you, and to hold a mirror up to ourselves and our organizations. And that's being reminded, isn't it? That's the narrative that we tell ourselves. Well, there can't be, it's maybe just Black people aren't good at that. Maybe they're just not, I don't know, it's just not a thing. But is that really true, or is that what we're telling ourselves?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's the bit when I just like, when I feel really patient, I can be like, very calm, and I go, right, I point to lots of examples and I give statistics. But other times I'm just like, oh my God, like, do you really, like, have you heard yourself? And they're like, I don't know what you mean, Sheree, but you get into that whole, like, I don't know what to say to you, because it's just like, it's just crazy. And I guess that's the bit that I think, because of the type of work that I do and the people that I talk with, I guess that's the bit that always worries me the most about the fact that this might be like a passing trend, meaning that, people pay attention, is because I know how dangerous it is when you have, people in leadership roles and people with power and people with influence who just hold on to this belief that the world treats everybody equally. Therefore, if you don't, if you're not in, it's something to do with you rather than something to do with the system. Because when you do that, you deny the chance for us to have a look critically and go, why does this not work for this group of people? What, do you know what I mean? And that's the bit that I get the most impassioned about, and try and get people to move past the so what of the conversation is start critically evaluating all aspects of how, and you can fill in the blanks, whether it's in education, whether it's in work, and get people really focused in, look at data, look at what's going on around you, look at, read the sentiment of your people and how they're feeling. Do you know what I mean?
I read an amazing statistic over the weekend, how in like the mid 1800s, if you looked at the students at Harvard University, there must have only been 800 in those days, but they were not just exclusive, only men, of course, all white, no Black people, no Jews, no Irish, no Italians, all from kind of like old school Boston families with money. So you think to yourself, that was the kind of intake, and it explains why, most of the presidents kind of had that fit, because that was where the elite universities, those are the kind of people that they turned out. Literally zero diversity. I mean, there was even one comment about the fact that you had to look really, really closely to be able to even tell the difference between the boys at the university. So, of course, if people aren't afforded that same education, then, you come out the other side. Of course, there's going to be little diversity in different arenas. So I think, you do need to start pretty much from the beginning to say that everyone has to have equal access to whatever it is, healthcare, education, all of these things, because that's what then you go out into the big wide world with. If you haven't had the same opportunities as other people, you're not going to have the same access.
No. And I think we just, because this could be like a whole different conversation, but I think we also have to recognize that there's so many things that inherently that are baked into the way as society treats Black people, that we, white is seen as good. Do you know what I mean? Just even by the name, Black, you talk about the fact that, white is good. And I've had people say to me, but it's not our fault, that we are the standard. Do you know what I mean? Like, literally, they said that we are the standard. So by definition, anybody who is different is bad. Not in the literal sense, but you know what I mean? Like, the difference, like, you've got to convince me that your difference is small enough for me to think that you're the same as me, type of thing. And if I had a £5 note for every time I've had that sort of, that level of conversation, and tried to get people to understand that, just by definition, if you're the majority, it doesn't mean that you're more superior. But that is the society that we're in right now, and that's why we're trying to push against that. That's why I'm trying to push against that and going, do you know what, different is just as equal, and it's not an inherent inferiority. It's not something about our intelligence. It's not something, there's so many more other things at play. But if you make it just about that, you're not looking around the whole world and questioning in the justice system and, you know, all of these things. You're not looking at it critically enough, you know, and I think that's where, you know, I would hope we get into more of the digging in the weeds and the roots, as I call it. And to your point, we go back into the context and history and go, how did we get here? Rather than everybody just wanting us so much to focus on the future. But you can only do that once you understand where we came from as history. Otherwise, it's just, you know, I don't want to hear that we're all humans on one rock, because half of us can't even get on the bloody rock. So I'm just like, wow.
I agree. And I think if you just present people with the data, they'll start to ask the wrong questions. If you explain the data with the historical context, I think people will realize quite how unfair it is, and they will seek to try and change that. But that requires, again, lots of conversations, lots of education, things that people just find inconvenient, to be frank.
Yeah.
It may not affect them. If it doesn't affect them, but what they also need to realize is that, like I said right at the beginning, it does affect them, because actually when you live in a very unequal society, it affects not just the people who are, you know, beneath you, but it affects all of us, because they're not being able to fulfill their potential for themselves and for the wider society.
Yeah. Right, and I think it's about the perspective again. If you've got people who are struggling to understand, well, it can't be wrong because I'm here. Well, you must be able to. I've succeeded, so why can't you succeed? Well, you have no idea because you've not gone. I'm very systems and operational, so you haven't gone through the same flowchart as me. You know, your nose aren't the same as mine. Your gates that open and close are different to mine, and the junctions that you meet are different. So actually, you can't possibly say that if you've got there, I should be able to get there, because you haven't done the things I've done and you haven't experienced the interactions that I've experienced. So until we really understand how systems work, and we go through systems step by step and understand what the barriers to different people are and what the barriers to understanding and access. I mean, let's just think about language to begin with. I've lived in another country where I didn't speak the language as my mother tongue, as my first language. Accessing services is really difficult. You think about people who are coming to our country who don't speak our language, and there are so many different types of language, whether it's the casual language or the office language or filling in forms. And you can even be a native speaker and still find it difficult to access. So there's so many levels of access. And unless we go through the flowchart or the system and understand what are the entrance and exit points, where do people drop off, what's the barrier? Well, this many people got through it, so it must be fine. Well, how many did you start the journey with? How many have you lost along the way? Because the measure of success isn't always how many reach the end. It's, you know, it's not those people who have won. It's who's gone through, what's their learning. So that is the system piece to me, the flowchart, the kind of organizational flowchart piece. But I don't have an answer though, by the way.
No, me neither. But you know what? It's a useful exercise because it just provokes more question and it forces people to question, doesn't it? It does. Well, we've been going for nearly an hour, so I know it's gone very quickly. So we have to finish. So I thought if you have, like, what's the one bit of, not even advice, like I always hate that. People go, what's the one bit of advice you would give to, you know, but thinking about, you know, people who are going to watch this tomorrow, because, you know, they're going to watch it on my YouTube channel tomorrow or here with us this evening. What would you say is like your parting words?
Gosh.
What now, haven't I?
I would say have those difficult conversations. Reach out to people in your network, out of your network. Ask them what challenges they face. Talk about the challenges you face and talk about how you can work together. Because as we've repeated, you know, every community faces very different struggles, but the kind of path to alleviating those struggles should be gone on together. So I think, you know, asking difficult questions of people outside of your community and learning from each other, showing allyship. Allyship, you know, it might not solve the world's problems, but it is extremely comforting to others to know, you know, it's not just people like me who care about this. It's people who are not like me who care, and that goes a long way to give you that kind of emotional support, making you realize that actually not everyone's fatigued. Other people are as concerned about this issue as you are. So really just reaching out beyond your own network, I think, is hugely important, and offering your own support to others.
Yes.
And I think to follow on to that and hopefully complement what Claudia has said, when you ask, really listen and actively listen, and listen to understand. Don't listen with the preconceived idea of what somebody is going to say, because we're all, I mean, I won't say we're all, because I'll be told that we're not all, but I know
generalization, Michelle, I'll be like, we know.
But actually really listen to understand, and don't come with your preconceived prepared response. Actually actively listen and be prepared to be uncomfortable, because if you're not uncomfortable, then you're not going to make change.
Yeah. And I guess my parting something is all of the above. And you know, just I really like what you said, Claudia, about the fact it's not only about reaching out to somebody and saying, you know, what are your challenges, but it's that whole thing about coming together in whatever way that looks like. Do you know what I mean? And going, right, you know, I want to do something, you know, I can see that you're doing this. Let me tell you what I'm thinking of, you know, and definitely trying to, because it's the ripple effect. But, you know, if we have more people doing a little bit of something, it's better than a few people doing a big something sometimes, you know, because it does have the ripple. So I guess I want people to know that we, you know, this isn't going away. So, you know, even if you haven't done anything up until now, and you know what I mean when I say anything, it doesn't mean like people been sitting, but if you've not engaged, if you've not tried to reach out, if you've not, you know, you can start from today, start from where you stand, start from here, you know, and just start engaging and having those conversations.
That's great.
Thank you for the opportunity, Shireen. I think it's been really great. Claudia and I have had some really interesting conversations about this experience leading up to it. And I'm grateful to have this opportunity, and it's been really good to talk, not just today, but in the lead up to it. So thank you, and for everything that you're doing, which is really impressive.
Oh, thank you. Well, likewise. And I'm just very appreciative to our magic friend who sent me Claudia's article. And I was like, hey, Claudia, so I've read your article. And then here we are, all this time away. So
it's been great having these discussions.
Yeah, it has. So I hope they can be replicated, you know, and we just won't know it, and that's fine. So thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all of the comments. So it is what it is, but I think people interacted with each other, which is always fine. So yeah, thank you all for kind of coming and just listening, you know, and engaging and giving your views. I hope even if, you know, you might not have got the answers to some of the burning questions that you had, you just found it interesting to just hear what we talked about. So thank you. And that's it. I'm going to sign off now.
Thank you.
Thanks.